Hi everybody, welcome to Psychology of Personality. This is our first lecture presentation of the semester. In it, we'll explore an overview of personality, including how personality is defined, why we study it, how we measure it, and conduct research to better understand it, as well as two of the major challenges that personality assessment measures and research studies face, the degree of reliability and validity. I recommend having the slides available as you view the lecture video so you can take notes as we proceed through the material. Let's get started. The first question that we need to ask is, what is personality? And while it's not an ideal response, the honest truth is that there is no universally agreed upon definition of personality. Personality can be considered to be a dynamic organization of systems that underlie and interact with thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and is somewhat consistent across time and situations in that it originates from within the person. With that said, our personality is affected by the situations that we face, and I'm sure we can all relate to the fact that we don't act the same way in all situations. This is referred to as situationism, situational specificity, and the person-situation debate. We'll begin to explore this more starting in the next lecture. For now, we can think of personality as patterns that reflect a person's typical style, patterns and other internal factors that affect our behaviors and make us distinct and unique from each other. You could think of personality as the summary of who a person is, or how you might describe yourself or someone else in terms of characteristics. You'll learn more about the definition of personality in this week's video, What is Personality? The next question is, why do we study personality? And as you might imagine, there are many great answers to this question. I think one of the reasons it's important to learn about personality is that it's really valuable to ourselves as individuals and as a society to understand ourselves better and to understand each other better too. To determine the answer for yourself, it might help to reflect on why you've decided to take this course. Hopefully it's not just an open course that meets a graduation requirement, but if it is, I hope you discover another reason why it's helpful for you as we progress through the course. Personality really helps us understand the individual differences and similarities between people, which helps us understand how we function and how other people function. Personality theorists look at these similarities and differences and ask why they occur and where they came from. In essence, personality helps us understand not only our own functioning, but our interpersonal functioning as well. This understanding can also facilitate connection, insight into personal and interpersonal problems, and some degree of predictability in terms of how people think, feel, and behave. Gordon Allport was an American psychologist who is considered to be a pioneer in terms of his research on human personality. He set out to operationalize the definition of personality so it could be measured and evaluated through research. Many refer to him as a trait psychologist and a founding figure of personality psychology. He wrote the book that popularized the term personality, which is entitled Personality, A Psychological Interpretation, published in 1937. Allport's definition of personality is, quote, the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems that determine his characteristic behavior and thought, end quote. This was introduced in his 1961 book, Pattern and Growth in Personality. Allport's working definition of personality is a fairly agreed-upon definition and can be broken down into 6 main features. First, personality is not just bits and pieces, but rather an organized structure. Allport suggested that if personality is disorganized, it can result in personality disorders and other mental health conditions, which we'll look at in the last unit of the course. Secondly, Allport suggested that personality involves active processes and is thus dynamic in nature, or as otherwise stated, is not static. That means it's constantly evolving and is influenced by factors like motivation, hunger, and the environment. Third, while personality is a psychological concept, it is also linked with the physical body and our physiological responses. Allport used the term psychophysical to refer to the fact that personality is reflective of the whole person. Fourth, personality occurs in patterns that are relatively stable across time and situation. By stable, he didn't mean that it never varies, but rather that personality influences thoughts and behaviors and creates consistent tendencies. You could be a generally outgoing person who feels nervous and acts quietly when you meet your partner's parents for the first time, or a typically kind person who snaps at your sister when you're tired and stressed. Fifth, personality serves as an underlying force that determines how people relate and interact with the world around them. For example, an introverted person tends to prefer less sensory stimulation than an extrovert does. Lastly, personality is displayed in many ways through thoughts, behaviors, and feelings. We express our personalities in everything we do, from how we interact with others, how we think about ourselves, other people, our surroundings, to how we act when we're hurt or excited. We discuss personality in terms of theories, and we test and modify those theories through research. A theory is essentially a general principle or set of principles about a class of events. Put simply, it's a statement about how things work. Theories help us explain phenomena and help us predict information in the future. Good theories are parsimonious in that they are as simple as possible, based on as few assumptions as possible, and also informed by as broad a base of information as possible. Good theories should also be testable, which is where research comes in. Research involves collecting and analyzing data in order to confirm and or disconfirm aspects of existing theory and or to develop a new theory. Research then helps us develop theories in the first place, as well as modify theories as needed and as informed by research findings. Ultimately, the role of research in terms of personality psychology is to help us gauge how accurate or how useful a theory or an approach to an assessment might be. One thing to watch out for when it comes to research is schema confirmation bias. This refers to our tendency as humans to look for evidence that supports our assumptions and to more easily overlook evidence that fails to support our assumptions. That is, we disproportionately tend to notice and put weight on information that aligns with what we already believe or what we want to believe, and we tend to not notice and or more easily disregard information that contradicts what we believe or want to believe. This results in an inflated sense of confidence because it will seem that there's a mountain of evidence that supports you and very little that doesn't. That's why it's paramount to deliberately seek out information that disconfirms your theories. You want to go out of your way to find evidence that you're wrong. If you can't find it, that's the evidence you're looking for that you might be right. The relationship between theory and research is one in which they inform each other. Theory helps to give us predictions for how research might turn out, and research results inform our theories. Again, whether that be the development of a new theory or a modification to an existing one. In everyday life, this is similar to meeting a new person. We quickly develop theories about that person based on what we know and our observations. But as the interactions unfold, you modify your theories about them. For example, you might originally theorize that a person is confident, but once you have a deep conversation with them and they share that they're actually quite insecure, that will change how you view them over time. The more you get to know a person, the more accurate and reflective of the whole person your theory will be. Data collection is an essential aspect of research that involves gathering the information we need to measure an individual or group's thoughts, feelings, and/or behaviors. There are a number of approaches to data collection. First, there's self-report, which often involves inventories or questionnaires in which the participant answers questions about themselves. These might be true-false, ratings on a Likert scale, for example, between 1 and 5, or between strongly disagree and strongly agree, or the face that best reflects your mood, as seen in the bottom left image. It could also involve finishing sentences such as, "I feel most myself when blank," or checking a box on a long list of traits to demonstrate which you think apply to you, such as in the bottom right picture. There are many popular self-report personality measures, such as the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, Costa and McRae's revised NEO Personality Inventory, the DISC Assessment, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, Cattell's 16 Personality Factors, and Eysink's Personality Inventory, amongst many others. In contrast to self-report, researchers may gather informant reports, which involve asking people close to the individual of interest about their personality. Another category of data collection is referred to as projective. Projective tests involve a variety of approaches that all give the participant the opportunity to give subjective, free responses. This might involve interpreting ink blots, for example, as is the case with the Rorschach test, displayed in the middle image. The researcher or analyst then interprets the participants' responses. For example, if that image looks more like a pelvis, it would be interpreted differently than if you viewed it as a cloud. There are also projective tests that ask the participant to describe an ambiguous scene, such as the thematic apperception test. There are also tests that ask the participant to describe how a sentence might end or to complete a word association test by sharing what comes to mind when they hear certain words or phrases, or to describe an inanimate object with human characteristics. What all of the projective tests have in common is that a professional, typically a psychologist, administers the test and interprets the results. Next, there's observation, which, just like it sounds, refers to observing participants, either in their natural settings, such as watching children play during recess, which is called naturalistic observation, or in an artificial setting like a laboratory, such as having children play video games and then placing them in a room with a blow-up doll to see how aggressively they behave. Test data is another approach to data collection. Test data involves a variety of standardized data, such as high school GPA, SAT scores, or a set of responses in the study itself. For example, the researcher might give the participant $20 and ask them to divide that amongst a group, and then document their approach to dividing the money. The last approach we'll discuss is life outcome data, which is typically sourced through public records, such as those pertaining to legal history, marital history, or medical history. It can also be collected by tracking participants over a long period of time in longitudinal research designs. The pros and cons of these approaches are discussed by a clinician who uses them in this week's video, Personality Research Methods. You'll also have opportunities in this course to take many self-report measures, starting next week with the IP-IP-NEO. There are a number of approaches to research studies. Let's look at the main three. Case studies are an in-depth exploration of a single individual, or perhaps a small number of individuals, or even a group in some cases, usually over a relatively long period of time and always in a great deal of depth. The goal of case studies is to obtain detailed and vivid descriptions of the person or people involved. For example, it might be a person with a rare location of a brain tumor that results in psychologically interesting symptoms, or it could be a prolific serial killer, like you'll see in this week's brief case study about Ted Bundy. Case studies are approached from multiple data collection angles, including interviews, self-report and informant report, repeated observations in as many settings as possible, life history documents such as marriage certificates, legal documents or journals, and anything else the researcher can get their hands on. These studies highlight factors that spur new questions and new hypotheses, which can be further studied using other approaches, such as correlational and experimental designs. Correlational studies seek to examine the relationship between two or more variables. For example, is physical attractiveness related to self-confidence? Is self-esteem related to academic performance? Or is intelligence related to financial success? The goal of correlational studies is to apply these findings to hopefully a wide population, which we refer to as generalizing. This works best when the study is conducted on a large and diverse pool of participants so that the findings are applicable to the wider population. Correlational studies can tell us about the direction and strength of a relationship, but cannot tell us about the actual timing or nature of that relationship. Therefore, as you might have heard before, correlational studies cannot tell us about causation. So correlational studies might provide evidence that people who are low in self-esteem also tend to have low GPAs. That would be a positive correlation because as one variable increases, the other variable does, and as one decreases, the other variable does as well. But it does not mean that low self-esteem causes poor grades or that having high self-esteem would result in higher grades. It only means that they are positively correlated. This relationship may be due to the fact that people with low self-esteem tend to avoid coming to class, are more anxious, or a variety of other factors. To cover it briefly, a negative correlation refers to variables that are inversely related. For example, drinking alcohol every night of the week is negatively correlated with GPA. That is, the more often you drink, the lower your GPA, and vice versa. Again, this is not the same thing as saying drinking alcohol every night causes low GPA. It might be that someone who drinks every day is already depressed and doesn't care about their grades at this point. Or it could be that someone with low GPA has given up and is drinking every night to avoid the sense of disappointment. The strength of a correlation refers to the degree of accuracy in terms of predicting values on one dimension from the other. How confident we can be in predicting that someone with low self-esteem will have a low GPA. Ultimately, correlational studies can tell us about the direction and strength of a relationship, but it cannot tell us what explains that relationship or anything about the timing of that relationship. For example, there is a positive correlation between murder and ice cream sales, but obviously one doesn't cause the other. Instead, this is the perfect example of the third variable effect, in which summer actually explains the relationship. Murder and ice cream have nothing directly to do with each other, except that they're both more popular in the summer. Experimental designs solve the problems and drawbacks associated with correlational designs. It is the only approach in which the researcher can make inferences about causality. Experimental designs involve creating a situation in which the researcher can control and manipulate the independent variable or variables. The researcher can then observe the effects of these differences. The independent variable in an experimental design is the variable that the researcher manipulates. It is the cause in the cause and effect relationship. The dependent variable is the variable that the researcher measures and observes. It is the observed effect in the cause and effect relationship. Experimental designs allow the researcher to exercise a high degree of control over the situation, which allows them to rule out third variables and determine the direction of the cause and effect relationship. For example, if a researcher wanted to evaluate a new pain reliever called Pain Be Gone, they would first randomly assign people to the experimental group that will take the new medication and to a control group that will be given a sugar pill placebo. The study would be double-blind, which means neither the participants nor the researchers know which condition the participants are in. That way, expectancies do not affect the data. You'd be surprised what believing you'll feel better can do, even if you only took an inert sugar pill. In this example, the independent variable is the substance, either Pain Be Gone or placebo, and the dependent variable is the outcome, which might be a headache rating from 1 to 10. If participants who took Pain Be Gone experience more pain relief than those who took the placebo, the researcher would conclude that Pain Be Gone is effective for treating a headache. There are other research methods that you'll likely learn about more in other psychology courses, but for now, let's shift our attention to reliability and validity. Reliability refers to consistency in measurement, otherwise known as the absence of random error. You could think of reliability as consistency, repeatability, or dependability. The range for reliability is on a scale from 0, not reliable at all, to 1, perfectly reliable. Reliability is affected by factors such as the number of items on the inventory. We have higher reliability with more items, and the more homogeneous or similar the items, typically the higher the reliability. A bathroom scale is a good example of reliability. If you step on it and it says you're 150 pounds, and then 1 minute later you step back on and it says you're 110, would you keep using that scale? No, it's too unreliable. Validity refers to the extent to which you're accurately measuring what you intend to measure. That is, the absence of bias or the absence of systemic error. You can think of validity as being the meaningfulness, usefulness, or accuracy of the measure. Validity is measured on a scale from -1 to +1. -1 meaning completely invalid, and +1 meaning completely valid. For example, the Beck Depression Inventory is an assessment measure used to evaluate an individual's degree of depression. We need to ask ourselves, is this measure a valid assessment of depression? In order to establish validity, we would need to see that an individual with a high score on the BDI also express high degrees of depressive symptomatology. Moreover, someone with low scores on the BDI should be relatively free of depressive symptoms, or at least very low levels of it. I really like this image of reliability and validity because you can visually see them in terms of the target. The bullseye of each target reflects the true value. That's where a person would score each time if the measure was completely reliable and completely valid. The black dots represent the person's actual scores. Let's look at the first target in the top left. you can see that each of the attempts are clustered together around the center. That means the results of each attempt are similar to each other, that is, clustered, which means high reliability. And also, they're very close to the target, so high validity too. If we move to the lower left-hand target, you'll see an example of high reliability with a tight cluster of dots, but low validity since that cluster is located away from the center of the target. In the top right, you can see the opposite. The dots are spread out, which reflects low reliability, but are distributed around the center, which means high validity. In the bottom right, you see the worst case scenario. Here the dots are not clustered, and they are not distributed around the center, which reflects low reliability and low validity. As I shared on the last slide, reliability is another way of saying that an assessment is consistent, meaning it yields similar results each time. And again, reliability is measured on a scale from 0 to 1. Often the minimal acceptance score is 0.8. There are many types of reliability, and we'll briefly review 4 of them, 2 on this slide and 2 on the next. First, internal reliability speaks to the reliability within a set of observations or a single aspect of personality. One method of assessing internal reliability is called split half, which involves comparing parts of the assessment with other parts. For example, first half compared to the second half. If the entire assessment is measuring the same characteristic, the person's score should be about even on both halves. It could also be comparing odd questions to even questions, or a variety of other approaches. Bottom line, to have internal consistency, scores should be about the same when compared. Another approach to reliability is test-retest reliability, which is determined by giving the test to one person at 2 different times. Since personality is relatively stable across time, scores should be relatively stable each time the person takes it. Keep in mind, though, that practice effects can complicate this picture. For example, if you take an IQ test twice in a short amount of time, most people will do better the second time. In contrast to test-retest reliability, in which only one test is taken multiple times, parallel or alternate forms reliability is measured by giving the same person 2 different tests and comparing the results of both of those tests. For example, someone who gets a high score on the IP-IP-NEO trait of neuroticism should also score relatively high on the emotionality trait of the hexaco. Lastly, inter-rater reliability refers to the level of agreement between 2 or more observers on a subjective measure. Observer raters are open to quite a bit of bias and subjectivity, so it's very important that studies that utilize human raters can demonstrate reliability across those raters. Often this is accomplished by using very strict manuals or other approaches that help to remove some of that subjectivity. For example, studies that utilize the thematic apperception test follow a manualized approach to interpretation to improve consistency across raters. Just as there are many approaches to evaluating reliability, there are also numerous approaches to evaluating validity. As a reminder, validity refers to meaningfulness, usefulness, or accuracy. While there are other forms of validity that are not listed on this slide, such as face validity that measures the extent to which a measure appears to evaluate the construct of interest, the ones I'll be covering here tend to be the most important for us in terms of personality psychology. Let's start by looking at internal versus external validity. Internal validity refers to the extent to which the independent variable actually affected the dependent variable rather than something else. You could think of it as being the truth of a study's findings. For example, let's say there was non-random assignment to experimental groups. Perhaps I was studying my 331 students from last semester and decided to split them into groups based on whether they submitted their first assignment between Monday and Wednesday or between Thursday and Sunday. I then take the Monday through Wednesday group and offer them an extra week of individualized tutoring every week. At the end of the semester, the group with individualized instruction is a full letter grade ahead of the group who did not have that extra tutoring. So I conclude that my extra hour of tutoring resulted in better grades. What's the problem here? Non-random assignment is a major threat to internal validity because it raises the likelihood that something else explains the change in the dependent variable. In this case, it might look like my extra tutoring was helpful. But what if students who submitted their assignments early into the week were going to get higher grades anyway? Perhaps it's their high conscientiousness that prompted them to submit work early, or perhaps it's the amount of time they have to dedicate to learning. At the end of the day, non-random group assignment means I cannot reliably conclude that the dependent variable, grades, was affected by the independent variable, tutoring. For the record, this is also a great example of correlation does not equal causation. You cannot have a true experimental design if you do not have random assignment. Internal validity is also affected by other factors, one that we touched on earlier, which is practice effects that occur from the same participant taking the same assessment measure multiple times. External validity refers to the extent to which the findings of a study can be generalized or applied to other people or other situations. You could think of it as being applicability to real life. External validity is further subdivided into population external validity. Can these results generalize across different types of people? And ecological validity. Can these results generalize across different contexts? For example, laboratory-based observations are criticized for having low external validity because the setting does not reflect the normal situation for participants. This is referred to as differences in stimulus characteristics. Conversely, laboratory observations have very high internal validity because the experimenter has a lot of control over the variables. Other factors that serve as threats to external validity are differences between the sample and the population. For example, studying elder adults in a very expensive assisted living home and then trying to generalize the findings to all elder adults. This is referred to as differences in sample characteristics. Let's look at some other forms of validity. Content validity is judged by experts. There's no numerical validity coefficient. Essentially, content validity refers to the extent to which a measure accurately evaluates the content area as determined by experts. Construct validity refers to how adequately a test measures a hypothetical construct. First off, a construct is simply a concept or a characteristic that cannot be directly observed and therefore must be measured by indicators that are similar to it. For example, we can't see ambition, but we can measure ambition by looking at variables like academic and professional achievements. Construct validity is calculated by factor analysis or some other form of multi-trait, multi-method matrix, which is similar to a table. It relies on convergent and discriminant validity. Convergent meaning how well the existing established measures of the same construct correlate with the new measure, and discriminant, also known as divergent, refers to how much a conceptually different measure correlates with the new one. We want convergent validity to be high because it's a good sign if the new measure provides similar results to an existing measure that is assessing the same thing. For example, if I created a new measure of depression, I would want it to correlate highly with the Beck Depression Inventory. In terms of discriminant validity, we want to see that there's a notable difference between the new measure that's assessing depression and an existing measure of, let's say, introversion, since these are two very different constructs. We don't want those scores to be highly correlated. Some of the major threats to construct validity pertain to the relationship between the participant and the researcher. For example, the Rosenthal effect, also known as experimenter expectancies, involve cues transmitted by the experimenter to the participant. In the drug study example, if the researcher was not blind, they might say something that gives the condition away, such as, "Oh, wow, you're feeling better, huh?" which would tell the participant that they took the placebo and might influence their responses on the dependent variable measure, in this case, the headache scale. At this point, it becomes a measure of expectancy rather than a true measure of the effectiveness of pain begone. Criterion-related validity refers to how adequately scores can infer or predict or estimate a criterion outcome. It's scored on a continuum between -1 and +1, with scores of about 0.2 or above considered to be acceptable. Concurrent validity refers to situations in which the predictor and the outcome are measured and correlated at the same time. For example, student GPA correlated with the current number of alcoholic drinks per week. Predictive validity refers to situations in which there is a long delay between predictor and outcome. For example, high school GPA being used to predict college GPA. Statistical conclusion validity refers to how reasonable the conclusions are based on the approach to statistical analysis. It relates to the sample size, amount of power in the study, selection of the specific statistical tests, and any other factors that influence the statistical analyses and results. If you have not yet taken research methods, I recommend watching the optional video, 4 Types of Validity, that covers internal, external, construct, and statistical conclusion validity in more detail. Have you ever wondered about the reliability and validity of personality tests? Spoiler alert! While personality tests can be enlightening for the user and have some applicability in terms of job selection and other uses, there are considerable challenges in terms of reliability and validity. You'll learn more about these challenges in this week's video, How Do Personality Tests Work? On that note, before we conclude this week's lecture, you'll notice in the course that there are numerous assigned and optional assessments that you'll complete throughout the semester. While personality inventories often struggle in terms of reliability and validity, there's a lot to learn about ourselves and others through reflection and considering how they apply and do not apply based on our own observations and experiences. I have opted to keep the cost low in this course, so while many of the assigned assessments have paid versions that are typically more well-known and perhaps in some cases more reliable and/or valid, I've decided to only assign free options. If you're in the financial position that you'd like to pay for more detailed results or are interested in taking other versions of the tests assigned, please reach out and I'll be glad to point you in the right direction.